History is a river, its course often appearing inevitable in retrospect. We see the world as it is and assume it was always meant to be, but sometimes the riverbed cracks. The flow of events teeters on a knife's edge, and with the slightest shift, a new unforeseen channel is carved. For the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the 1990s was such a moment, a decade of profound crisis where the state and the ideology that sustained it stared into the abyss. The decade began with the ground crumbling beneath Pyongyang's feet. The Soviet Union, its Cold War patron and economic lifeline, disintegrated with breathtaking speed. The flow of subsidized fuel, food, and industrial goods that had kept the North Korean state afloat simply vanished. This external shock was catastrophic, compounded by a series of devastating floods and droughts that ravaged the country's already inefficient agricultural sector. The result was a famine of biblical proportions, a period the state itself would euphemistically label the arduous march. But for the millions of ordinary North Koreans who suffered, it was a time of unimaginable horror. Starvation was not a threat, it was a daily reality. The public distribution system, the bedrock of the state's control over its populace, sputtered and died. Then in the summer of 1994, the unthinkable happened. Kim Il-sung, the eternal president, the sun-like figure around whom the entire nation had revolved for nearly half a century, died of a sudden heart attack. His demise left a power vacuum and a crisis of faith. For decades, he had been the singular, unchallengeable center of gravity. His son, Kim Jong-il, was the designated heir, but his succession was far from assured. He lacked his father's charisma, his revolutionary credentials, and most importantly, the deep-seated loyalty of the old guard. The state, already crippled by economic collapse and famine, now faced a crisis of leadership. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability, a convergence of pressures that by any rational calculation should have spelled the end. The Juche ideology, a fierce brand of self-reliance, was being tested by a reality of absolute dependency and systemic failure. The world watched, holding its breath. Intelligence agencies from Seoul to Washington predicted the regime's imminent collapse. The question was not if it would fall, but when and what would come after. But what if they had been right? What if the internal contradictions, the external pressures, and the sheer human suffering had overwhelmed the state's capacity to endure? What if the Democratic People's Republic of Korea had not survived the 1990s? This is the story of a world that could have been, a timeline where the river of history broke its banks, a world without the North Korea we know today. The consequences of that collapse would have rippled across the globe, a political, military, and humanitarian earthquake that would have reshaped the 21st century. This is the story of what might have been if North Korea had collapsed. July 8, 1994. In the secretive, cloistered world of Pyongyang, an announcement is made that sends a seismic shock through the nation. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, the man who was not merely a ruler but a god in the state's political theology, is dead. For 46 years, his word was law, his image ubiquitous, his authority absolute. Now there is only a deafening silence. His designated successor, his son Kim Jong-il, had been groomed for power for over 2 decades. Yet his position was far more precarious than the world knew. Lacking his father's revolutionary gravitas and facing a cadre of powerful, older figures within the military and party, the younger Kim was viewed with skepticism, even disdain, by some in the inner circle. Declassified diplomatic cables from the era would later reveal that American officials considered him goofy, and Russian experts predicted his rule would last 2 years at most. In our history, Kim Jong-il, through a deft and brutal combination of purges, political maneuvering, and the elevation of the military through his Songun, or military-first, policy, consolidated his rule. But in this timeline, the cracks in the foundation of his power spread too quickly. The key difference is a failure of nerve and a crisis of loyalty at the heart of the elite. His own uncle, Kim Yong-ju, who had once been considered a potential heir himself, and Oh Jin-yu, the aged and deeply respected minister of the People's Armed Forces, head a faction of the old guard. They do not move openly against Kim Jong-il, but they do not move for him either. They hesitate. They hedge their bets, issuing vague directives and fostering a climate of uncertainty. This paralysis at the top proves fatal. With no single, clear voice of command emanating from Pyongyang, the already brittle state apparatus begins to shatter. The first and most vital system to break is the one that sustains life itself, the public distribution system. For decades, the state's power rested on its role as the sole provider. Every citizen received their rations, their allotment of grain, oil, and vegetables from the government. This was not generosity, it was the primary mechanism of control. But the system had been failing for years, crippled by economic mismanagement, the end of Soviet subsidies, and the inherent inefficiencies of collectivized agriculture. By 1994, daily grain rations for many urban workers had already dwindled to a meager 150 grams a day, a fraction of what was needed to survive. Now, with the central command in disarray, the distribution network collapses completely. Trucks sit idle for want of fuel. Provincial officials, receiving no clear orders from Pyongyang, begin to hoard what little grain reserves they have, prioritizing their local security forces. For millions of city dwellers and factory workers in non-essential industries, the rations simply stop coming. Hunger, once a chronic ache, becomes an acute, screaming agony. The government propaganda machine, which had for years churned out messages of self-reliance and patriotic endurance, sputters into irrelevance. Radios broadcast funereal music for the deceased great leader, but offer no solutions, no food, no hope. The silence from the new leadership is interpreted for what it is: weakness and incompetence. The true communists, the ones who obediently waited at home for the state to save them, are the first to die. But others, driven by the primal need to survive, do not wait. The change begins not as a revolution but as a riot. In the northeastern industrial city of Chongjin and the surrounding Hamgyong province, a region historically treated with suspicion by the Kim regime and deliberately triaged during the famine, the first sparks ignite. It starts with a crowd of starving factory workers storming a local grain silo, a place they know holds reserves for the military and party elite. The local police, themselves hungry and with families to feed, are overwhelmed. Some fire into the air, others simply melt away, unwilling to die to protect food their own children are denied. The news spreads not by state media, but through whispers, rumors, and the desperate travelers who now illegally move between cities searching for food. The Chongjin riot emboldens others. Similar uprisings erupt in Hamhung, Wonsan, and Sinaju. These are not coordinated political movements, they are spasms of desperation. The state's monopoly on violence, the ultimate guarantor of its power, evaporates at the local level. The social contract, brutally simple in North Korea, obedience in exchange for survival, is broken by the state itself. With its collapse, the justification for obedience vanishes. This internal chaos quickly spills over the nation's borders. The Tumen and Yalu rivers, the traditional frontier with China, have always been porous, but now the trickle of defectors becomes a flood. Entire families, hollow-eyed and emaciated, brave the currents and the nervous border guard. As to escape the land of starvation. Initially, China's local response is inconsistent. Border guards, many of whom are ethnically Korean, are torn between sympathy and orders from Beijing. The most dangerous development for the splintering regime is the disintegration of the Korean People's Army. The KPA was designed to be a state within a state, a privileged class, but privilege is relative. High-ranking officers in Pyongyang may still eat well, but the common soldier in a rural barracks is starving just like the civilians. His loyalty to a distant, silent dear leader in Pyongyang is tested by the gnawing in his stomach. We see the first large-scale desertions. Entire platoons and then companies abandon their posts. Some simply discard their weapons and attempt to blend into the civilian population, heading for the Chinese border. Others, more daringly, turn their weapons on their own officers and side with the rioters, seizing control of local armories and food depots. The command structure fractures. Mid-level commanders, receiving conflicting or no orders from Pyongyang, are forced to make their own choices. Remain loyal to a collapsing regime, secure their own territory and resources, or join the burgeoning chaos. An attempted coup by officers of the VI Army Corps in Hamhung, which in our timeline was brutally crushed, now finds fertile ground, linking up with other mutinous units and armed civilian groups. The world watches in a state of stunned paralysis. In Seoul, the government of President Kim Jong-sam is thrown into turmoil. His three-stage national community unification formula, a policy designed for a gradual, peaceful reconciliation, is rendered instantly obsolete. The nightmare scenario, a hard landing or collapse, is happening, and far faster than anyone had anticipated. Emergency meetings are held, but the options are all grim. A full-scale military intervention would be bloody and unpredictable. Doing nothing risks a humanitarian catastrophe of unparalleled scale, and a wave of potentially millions of refugees pouring south. In Beijing, the reaction is one of alarm. President Jiang Zemin's government had long propped up Pyongyang as a strategic buffer against the democratic, US-allied South Korea. Now they face the dual threats of a massive refugee crisis destabilizing their northeastern provinces and the terrifying prospect of a unified Korea, potentially hosting American troops directly on their border. They begin to move troops to the Yalu not to intervene, but to seal the border and contain the chaos. And in Washington, the Clinton administration, which just months earlier had been on the brink of war over North Korea's nuclear program and had signed the tenuous agreed framework, now faces a far more complex crisis. The immediate fear is the security of the nuclear material at Yongbyon. Who controls it? Could it be sold to the highest bidder by a rogue commander? The second fear is the sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster. The political collapse has created a power vacuum, turning a famine into a nationwide state of anarchy. The carefully constructed world of Cold War certainties on the Korean Peninsula has vanished. In its place is a black hole of unpredictability. The dynasty has not just fallen, it has shattered, and the pieces are now hurtling in every direction, threatening to tear the entire region apart. The collapse has begun.
The latest satellite imagery indicates a significant escalation of unsanctioned industrial activity.
We demand immediate verification.
Chaos cannot be contained by a line on a map. As the North Korean state disintegrated from within, the shockwaves surged outward, slamming first into its immediate neighbors. The world's response was not a coordinated, singular action, but a frantic, dissonant symphony of self-interest, fear, and strategic calculation. In Beijing, the collapse of the Kim regime was viewed not as a triumph for democracy, but as a catastrophic failure of their foreign policy. For decades, China had tolerated North Korea's belligerence and economic dependency in exchange for one crucial benefit: a strategic buffer. Pyongyang kept the democratic, US-allied South at arm's length, preventing the nightmare scenario of American troops stationed along the Yalu River. Now that buffer was not just eroding, it was imploding. President Jiang Zemin, a pragmatist concerned with China's own economic transformation, gave the order. The People's Liberation Army's Northern Theater Command moved with decisive speed. This was not an invasion, but a stabilization operation, in the careful language of Beijing's diplomats. Tens of thousands of PLA troops fanned out along the border, their primary mission to halt the biblical exodus of starving North Koreans. The Tumen and Yalu rivers, once porous escape routes, became hardened, militarized zones. Refugee camps, hastily constructed and brutally managed, swelled with hundreds of thousands of desperate people. But China's objectives went beyond border control. Under the pretext of securing humanitarian corridors and preventing wider chaos, PLA units pushed miles deep into North Korean territory, seizing control of key infrastructure, bridges, rail lines, and the approaches to major cities like Sinuiju and Rasan. The unspoken goal was clear: to carve out a de facto buffer zone, a sphere of influence in the northern half of the peninsula that would persist long after the chaos subsided. Beijing would ensure that whatever new reality emerged, it would not be a unified, democratic Korea under Seoul's control and Washington's influence, right on its doorstep. If China's response was one of decisive action, South Korea's was one of paralytic shock. The reunification of Korea was the nation's foundational dream, a sacred aspirational goal for nearly half a century. But the reality of a sudden collapse was its greatest nightmare. The government of President Kim Jong-sam, the first civilian president in over 3 decades, was utterly overwhelmed. For years, think tanks like the Korea Development Institute had published terrifying estimates of the cost of reunification, with figures ranging from $200 billion to over $1 trillion. It was the economic equivalent of Germany's reunification, but with a partner state that was not just poorer, but catastrophically broken, with a starving population and no functional infrastructure. The South Korean stock market, the KOSPI, went into freefall as investors panicked at the prospect of the nation absorbing 23 million impoverished people. A bitter, frantic debate paralyzed the government in Seoul. Hardliners in the military and conservative factions argued for an immediate, robust intervention. They advocated for the Republic of Korea Army to cross the DMZ, secure Pyongyang, and assert Seoul's sovereignty over the entire peninsula, preempting Chinese influence. But moderates and economic advisors painted a chilling picture of the consequences: a potential guerrilla war with remnant KPA units, a direct confrontation with Chinese troops in the north, and a domestic economic collapse that would erase decades of South Korean progress. President Kim Jong-sam, caught between the nationalist fervor of his people and the catastrophic economic warnings of his advisors, hesitated. He placed the military on its highest alert and made passionate speeches about a shared destiny, but delayed the ultimate decision to move north. The government appealed for international aid, but its own capacity to manage the crisis was crumbling under the political and economic strain. The dream of reunification had arrived as a terrifying demon, threatening to devour its host. In Washington, the Clinton administration faced its own strategic nightmare. The 1994 Agreed Framework, a fragile diplomatic pact designed to freeze North Korea's plutonium production in exchange for aid, was now meaningless. The central overriding fear was singular and terrifying: loose nukes. North Korea was believed to possess enough plutonium for 1 or 2 nuclear devices, located at the Yongbyon nuclear complex. With the Central Command in Pyongyang gone, who controlled that material? A rogue general, a desperate faction looking to sell it on the black market to the highest bidder. The White House's primary objective became securing the nuclear sites at all costs. Special Operations Forces were placed on high alert for a potential airborne assault to seize or destroy the Yongbyon facility. But such an operation was fraught with peril. It could be seen as an act of war by whatever factions remained, and would certainly be condemned by China, potentially leading to a direct superpower confrontation on the peninsula. Washington found itself in a frustrating position. It urged Seoul to take the lead, yet feared the South Koreans were too slow and indecisive. It watched China's moves in the north with intense suspicion, but lacked the leverage to stop them without risking a wider war. Frantic diplomatic calls between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo sought to forge a unified strategy, but their interests were not perfectly aligned. The US wanted denuclearization above all else, South Korea wanted stable reunification, and China wanted a neutered, divided peninsula. The alliance, built for Cold War certainty, was straining under the pressures of post-Cold War chaos. Japan, separated by a stretch of sea, watched the mainland's turmoil with a unique and profound anxiety. Under the pacifist coalition government of Prime Minister Tomiichi Murayama, Japan's capacity for military action was constitutionally limited and politically unthinkable. Their fears were twofold. First was the specter of a refugee crisis arriving by sea. The government dreaded the possibility of rickety North Korean fishing boats, crammed with thousands of desperate people, washing up on Japan's shores, creating a humanitarian and political crisis it was ill-equipped to handle. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force was deployed on patrols, not for combat, but for maritime interdiction and rescue. The second fear was of rogue missile launches. North Korea possessed a fleet of Scud and Nodong missiles. In a total collapse, who controlled the launch keys? A desperate commander could, in a final act of nihilism, fire a missile at Japan. The psychological impact of such an attack, even with a conventional warhead, would be immense. Air defense systems were placed on high alert, and a deep sense of vulnerability gripped a nation that had for 50 years lived under the American nuclear umbrella, shielded from such direct threats. For Tokyo, the collapse was a terrifying reminder of its proximity to a dangerous and unpredictable part of the world. While the world's powers maneuvered for strategic advantage, the epicenter of the crisis remained the human one. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, the Security Council was deadlocked. The United States and its allies pushed for a resolution authorizing a multinational force to enter North Korea, secure nuclear sites, and establish safe zones for humanitarian aid. But the resolution was immediately met with the threat of a veto from China, which saw it as a transparent attempt to legitimize a Western-led occupation, and was backed by a skeptical Russia. Beijing proposed its own resolution, calling for all external forces to remain out and for aid to be funneled through Chinese-controlled channels in the north. The result was paralysis. As diplomats debated procedure and semantics in New York, the death toll inside North Korea climbed into the hundreds of thousands and then millions. The great powers were trapped in a classic security dilemma. Every move one nation made to secure its own interests, China's buffer zone, America's focus on nukes, South Korea's hesitant ambition, was interpreted as a threat by the others. The global response to the collapse was not a rescue mission, but a geopolitical competition fought over the ruins of a failed state. The international community had failed its first major post-Cold War test, and for the people of Korea, the chaos was just beginning.
They're taking down the flag! Get this! Get all of this!
A capital city is more than a seat of government. It is a symbol, a psychological fortress. For decades, Pyongyang was the ultimate showcase of the Juche ideology, a meticulously crafted stage of wide boulevards, monumental architecture, and orchestrated prosperity, hermetically sealed from the rot consuming the countryside. While the provinces starved, the capital's residents, the party faithful, and the core elite were the last to feel the system's decay. But by late 1994, the fortress walls were breached. The chaos that had consumed the periphery finally came for the center. The end of Pyongyang began not with an invading army, but with the desperate footsteps of its own people. Tens of thousands of starving citizens, having walked for weeks from the blighted northern and southern provinces, appeared on the city's outskirts. They were a skeletal army of ghosts, their presence a terrifying, undeniable refutation of the state's propaganda. The Pyongyang Defense Command, the elite corps tasked with protecting the capital, attempted to form a cordon, but the soldiers were themselves residents of the city, with families who were beginning to go hungry as rations dwindled even for the privileged. Their resolve crumbled. The sight of their fellow countrymen emaciated and dying at the city limits was a more powerful force than any military order. Simultaneously, the paralysis and infighting within the leadership reached its zenith. In our timeline, Kim Jong-il ruthlessly purged his opponents and secured the military's loyalty. In this reality, with the country in flames, his authority evaporates. The old guard, led by figures like his uncle Kim Yong-ju and military traditionalists, refuse to rally behind the failing son. They see him not as the heir to a dynasty, but as the architect of its demise. Different factions within the Korean People's Army, loyal to different patrons, begin to issue conflicting orders. Some units attempt to suppress the incoming refugees and burgeoning food riots. Others stand down, hoarding their ammunition and fuel, waiting to see who would emerge victorious from the power struggle. The tipping point comes when a key garrison of the Pyongyang Defense Command, facing a massive crowd of rioters demanding access to a central party food reserve, makes a fateful decision. Instead of firing on the people, they turn their guns on the Ministry of Public Security, agents guarding the warehouse, and throw open the doors. It is an act of mutiny that spreads like wildfire. The state's authority in its own capital dissolves in a matter of hours. The city descends into a vortex of violence and score settling. Loyalists to Kim Jong-il battle factions of the old guard in the streets. Secret police officers are dragged from their offices and beaten by vengeful citizens. The symbols of the cult of personality are the first to be desecrated. Statues are toppled, portraits of the Kims are burned in massive bonfires, and the facades of government buildings are vandalized. The most secretive city on Earth has become a black box of anarchy, and the world can only guess at the fate of Kim Jong-il and the ruling elite, presumed to be hunkered down in their fortified underground bunkers. This final undeniable collapse forces the hand of the South. In Seoul, President Kim Young-sam could hesitate no longer. The specter of Chinese troops advancing south to fill the power vacuum in Pyongyang, coupled with the horrifying, albeit fragmented, reports of anarchy from the few sources on the ground, made inaction impossible. He gives the order for Operation Northern Shield, a limited, rapid intervention with the stated goals of restoring order, providing humanitarian aid and securing critical infrastructure. The advance is spearheaded by the Republic of Korea Army's Capital Mechanized Infantry Division and the 707th Special Mission Battalion. They cross the demilitarized zone, the most heavily fortified border on Earth, which has become strangely quiet. Many KPA units, leaderless and starving, surrender without a fight, their soldiers emerging from their positions with hands raised, looking more like refugees than warriors. The entry into Pyongyang is not a jubilant liberation. It is a tense, surreal, and deeply somber affair. The city is smoldering, its grand squares scarred by fighting. While some citizens watch the arrival of the southern troops with cautious hope, many more stare with blank faces, a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and profound shock. Their entire reality, the only world they have ever known, has been violently dismantled. The South Korean soldiers, many of whom had been taught to view North Koreans as indoctrinated enemies, are confronted by a populace that is simply broken and starved. Embedded with the ROK forces are the first international journalists to enter the city freely in decades. Their cameras broadcast the astonishing, tragic scenes to the world, pulling back the curtain on the Hermie Kingdom for the first time. As South Korean forces secure key sites, the radio tower, the Grand People's Study House, the leadership compounds, and the world begin to uncover the true monstrous nature of the Kim regime, the discoveries are more horrific than the darkest Western intelligence estimates. Soldiers stumble upon vast, hidden complexes on the city's outskirts. These are the Kwanlizo, the political prison camps. Camp 22 near Reordering was known to the outside world through satellite imagery and defector testimony, but its reality on the ground is a vision of hell. The first soldiers and journalists to enter find thousands of skeletal inmates, clothed in rags, their bodies scarred by torture, their minds shattered by decades of abuse. Inside the archives of the Ministry of Public Security and the State Security Department, the occupiers find the regime's meticulous records of its own brutality. They find execution orders signed by high-ranking officials, detailed manuals on torture techniques, and lists containing the names of hundreds of thousands of purged individuals and their families, condemned for generations under the three-generation punishment policy. They find documents confirming that the famine was not merely a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe, with the regime deliberately withholding food aid from regions deemed politically disloyal. The scale of the human rights abuses is staggering, a crime against humanity on a level not seen since the days of Pol Pot or the Holocaust. The world, which had often treated North Korea as a bizarre, almost comical geopolitical oddity, is now confronted with the unassailable evidence of its genocidal character. This raw, unfiltered exposure to the truth creates a profound psychological crisis. For the North Korean people, especially the residents of Pyongyang who had been shielded from the worst of it, the shock is total. Their gods Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il are revealed to be mass murderers. The Juche ideology, their political religion, is exposed as a lie that starved millions to sustain the luxury of a tiny few. People wander the streets in a daze, their faces a canvas of confusion and grief. The liberation from tyranny is also the death of their entire universe of meaning. It is a transition not just of political power, but of the very consciousness of a nation. The fall of Pyongyang, however, does not signal the end of the crisis. It marks the beginning of a new, even more dangerous phase. As ROK forces consolidate their control over the capital and its immediate surroundings, China solidifies its stabilization zone in the north. The People's Liberation Army controls the industrial heartland of Hamgyong province and the border regions, and makes it clear that any further advance north by South Korean forces will be considered a hostile act. A tense line is drawn not by treaty but by the positions of two rival armies on the ground. Pyongyang has fallen, but Korea has not been unified. It has been effectively repartitioned, occupied by two external powers with conflicting agendas. The fall of the Kim dynasty has not brought peace, but has instead created a vacuum, drawing in its powerful neighbors and setting the stage for a new, uncertain, and potentially explosive confrontation.
This agreement is crucial for the stability of the entire region.
The latest intelligence reports are concerning.
We need a unified response.
The fall of Pyongyang was celebrated with cautious euphoria in the streets of Seoul. For 2 generations, the division of the peninsula had been a raw, open wound. Now the dream of a single, unified Korea seemed within reach. But as the ROK military secured the capital and the first wave of humanitarian aid flowed north, the sheer, crushing scale of the challenge ahead began to dawn on the government and people of South Korea. The victory over the Kim regime was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of an ordeal that would test the very soul of the nation and threaten to break its back. The road to reunification was not a highway to prosperity, but a treacherous path through the ruins of a collapsed civilization. The first and most immediate shock was economic. Planners in Seoul had long modeled the cost of reunification, but their scenarios were based on a gradual, controlled process. The sudden, violent collapse was the ultimate worst-case scenario. The German reunification, which had cost West Germany an estimated $2 trillion and led to years of economic stagnation, was immediately invoked as the closest parallel. But experts quickly realized the Korean situation was exponentially worse. The per capita income gap between East and West Germany in 1990 was roughly 3-to-1. In 1995, the gap between South and North Korea was at least 20-to-1. East Germany, for all its faults, had functioning infrastructure, a skilled industrial workforce, and a population that remembered a life before communism. North Korea had none of these. It was a failed state whose infrastructure had been rotting for decades and whose people had been systematically starved and terrorized into subservience. The government of Kim Jong-sam was forced to make an agonizing choice. To fund the initial stabilization and humanitarian relief, it passed an emergency reunification tax, a heavy surcharge on income and corporate profits. The move was met with immediate and fierce public backlash. The South Korean people, who had sacrificed for decades to build their miracle on the Han River, were now being asked to sacrifice again, this time for a people they had been taught to see as enemies. Protests erupted in Seoul and Busan, pitting nationalist idealists against pragmatic citizens terrified of losing their life savings and their children's future. The South Korean government had to go, cap in hand, to the IMF and the World Bank for massive loans, effectively mortgaging the nation's future to pay for the North's past. The cost of absorbing 23 million people, rebuilding every road, power line, and hospital, was projected to be in the trillions, a burden that would stall South Korea's own development for a generation or more. Beyond the staggering financial cost was a cultural chasm that seemed almost impossible to bridge. The two Koreas, while sharing a language and ancient history, had evolved into two different species of society. Decades of isolation and indoctrination under the Juche ideology had created a profound psychological rift. The first wave of South Korean aid workers, teachers, and administrators who went north found themselves facing a traumatized and deeply suspicious population. These were people who had been taught from birth that Southerners were American puppets and class enemies. They had no concept of private property, no experience with democratic norms, and no framework for understanding the world outside the Kim cult. Simple conversations were fraught with difficulty. The Korean language itself had diverged. Northern defectors often struggled with loanwords common in the south, and their dialect was seen as harsh and unsophisticated. The northern term for comrade, dongmu, was jarring to southerners who preferred the word friend, chingu. These were not mere semantic differences, they were windows into two incompatible worldviews. The South Korean government established massive resettlement and education centers throughout the north, attempting to deprogram an entire population. But teaching people who had been subjected to lifelong brainwashing about the principles of capitalism and democracy proved to be a monumental task. Many clung to the old ways out of fear or sheer confusion, while others swung to the opposite extreme, falling prey to scams and exploitation in a new, bewildering world of money and competition. This societal friction soon curdled into a new, dangerous form of internal conflict. With the collapse of the KPA and the state security apparatus, hundreds of thousands of men, trained only in violence and surveillance, were suddenly unemployed and dispossessed. These former soldiers, secret police agents, and enforcers did not simply integrate into the new society. They used their skills to survive. A brutal new criminal underworld emerged from the ashes of the regime. In cities like Hamhung and Cheongjin, far from the main hubs of South Korean control, former KPA officers formed sophisticated criminal syndicates. They controlled the black markets, ran protection rackets, and engaged in human trafficking, preying on the weak and vulnerable. These gangs, armed with weapons from looted state armories, represented a significant internal security threat. The fledgling South Korean-led police forces were outmanned and outgunned. Pitched battles between ROK security forces and these organized gangs became common in the northern provinces. For the average northerner, life had simply traded one form of terror for another. They were no longer afraid of the midnight knock from the secret police, but of the armed gangs who ruled the streets after dark. This lawlessness further delayed reconstruction and deepened the South's perception of the North as a chaotic, violent quagmire. The physical task of rebuilding the North was a challenge of Herculean proportions. The infrastructure was not just neglected, it was archaic. Roads were unpaved, bridges were unsafe, and the railway system was a relic of the Japanese colonial era. The power grid was non-existent in many rural areas, and factories were rusted shells, silent monuments to failed central planning. Decades of deforestation had led to catastrophic soil erosion, making much of the land unsuitable for farming. South Korean construction and engineering giants like Hyundai and Samsung were awarded massive contracts, and a slow, painful process of rebuilding began. But every new road and power plant only highlighted the immense work still to be done, and every one spent on the North was a one not spent on schools, hospitals, or social programs in the South. This created a growing sense of resentment. The initial patriotic fervor for reunification curdled into a bitter sentiment dubbed reunification fatigue by the media. Many Southerners began to see the North not as a long-lost brother to be embraced, but as a millstone around the nation's neck. Political parties fractured along pro- and anti-reunification lines, leading to years of government instability in Seoul. The dream had been achieved in name, but the reality was a nation geographically whole but spiritually and socially divided. Korea was one country, but it was inhabited by two peoples, separated by a DMZ that no longer existed on a map, but had been rebuilt in their minds. The greatest challenge was not rebuilding the North's infrastructure, but bridging the vast, silent gap between two hearts, two minds, two histories.
The territorial implications are significant.
We must ensure stability throughout the transition.
Our immediate concern is humanitarian aid and border security.
The end of a conflict rarely brings lasting peace. More often, it simply clears the board for a new, more complex game to begin. The collapse of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the fall of Pyongyang did not resolve the Korean question, it redefined it. The rigid, predictable standoff of the Cold War, a world of clear lines and established enemies, was shattered. In its place emerged a tumultuous new order in Northeast Asia, a triangular power struggle between a rising China, a repositioning America and a newly unified but deeply fractured Korea. The long-term consequences of the collapse would prove just as dangerous as the regime itself. For the People's Republic of China, the new reality on its border was a strategic challenge of the highest order. The buffer state was gone, replaced by a US ally. Beijing's response was a masterclass in pragmatic aggression. While its diplomats at the UN spoke of stability and non-interference, its military and economic arms moved to create a new, undeniable reality on the ground. The stabilization zone, carved out by the PLA in the northern provinces during the initial chaos, was never relinquished. It was not a formal annexation, but a transformation into a Chinese sphere of exclusive influence. Beijing poured billions into rebuilding the infrastructure of the Hamgyong and Pyongyang provinces, not as aid but as investment. Chinese state-owned enterprises rebuilt ports, railways, and mines in exchange for 99-year leases and exclusive resource rights. A new border, far more porous to Chinese trade, but just as hard against southern influence, was established. This created a state of permanent, low-grade tension with the unified government in Seoul. Korea was whole in name, but its northern industrial heartland was economically tethered to Beijing. China had effectively traded its problematic puppet state for a permanent and lucrative foothold on the peninsula, ensuring that a unified Korea would never be strong enough or independent enough to pose a threat. Beijing now held a powerful lever, capable of exerting immense economic pressure on Seoul at any time. This strategy locked the US and its Korean ally out of a vital strategic region and guaranteed China's role as the dominant mainland power for the 21st century. For Japan, the Korean collapse was a seismic shock that reawakened the nation from its post-war strategic slumber. For 50 years, Japanese foreign policy had been defined by economic development and a reliance on the American security guarantee, bound by Article 9 of its constitution, which renounced war. The sudden, violent implosion of a neighboring state, the flood of refugees, the threat of loose missiles, and the subsequent repartitioning of the peninsula by China and US-backed South Korea shattered this comfortable status quo. The crisis provided the ultimate justification for nationalist politicians who had long argued that Japan must become a normal nation, with a military commensurate with its economic power. The debate over constitutional reform, once a fringe issue, moved to the center of Japanese politics. While amending Article 9 proved to be a divisive and lengthy process, the shift in military posture was immediate and profound. Citing the new instability, Tokyo authorized a massive increase in defense spending. It invested heavily in missile defense systems, satellite intelligence, and its navy, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, transforming it into one of the most technologically advanced fleets in the world. Japan began to interpret its self-defense mandate more broadly, participating in international peacekeeping missions and enhancing military cooperation with the United States. The collapse of North Korea inadvertently untethered Japan from the strictest constraints of its post-war identity, setting it on a path toward becoming a major military player in Asia for the first time in half a century. The United States, the ostensible victor of this Cold War epilogue, found itself in the most uncomfortable position of all. Its primary goal, the end of the Kim regime and its nuclear threat, had been achieved, yet it now presided over a region more volatile than before. The most pressing question was the future of the 37,000 American troops stationed in Korea. Their original mission, to deter and defend against an invasion from the north, was obsolete. China immediately and relentlessly demanded their complete withdrawal, framing their continued presence as an unacceptable relic of the Cold War and an aggressive posture on its border. This demand found a surprisingly receptive audience within Korea itself. Many South Koreans, groaning under the immense economic burden of reunification, began to question why they should continue to pay for the upkeep of American bases when the direct threat was gone. A potent strain of nationalism, fueled by the pride of reunification and the resentment of dependence, surged through the ULES, Washington argued that its forces were a vital stabilizing presence, a check against Chinese expansionism and a guarantee of regional security. But the US-Korea alliance, once a simple and solid pact, became a subject of bitter annual renegotiations, strained by disputes over cost-sharing and strategic purpose. This strategic friction ignited the single most dangerous consequence of the collapse, the question of a Korean nuclear weapon. In the years following reunification, a powerful and secretive consensus began to form within the Korean military and political establishment. They were now a nation of 70 million, facing a nuclear-armed China that occupied its northern territories and a rapidly rearming Japan with latent nuclear capabilities. Relying on the American nuclear umbrella seemed increasingly uncertain in a world where US interests might diverge from their own. The logic was cold and compelling. For true sovereignty and ultimate security, Korea needed its own deterrent. Using the scientific knowledge inherited from the South and the fissile material and data recovered from the North, a clandestine program was born. When US intelligence inevitably uncovered evidence of this program in the early 2000s, it triggered the gravest crisis in the alliance's history. The United States, the global champion of non-proliferation, found its own ally on the verge of joining the nuclear club. It placed Washington in an impossible position: crack down on Seoul and potentially shatter the alliance, leaving a unified Korea to fend for itself against China, or grudgingly accept a new nuclear power, demolishing the Non-Proliferation Treaty and triggering a nuclear arms race across Asia. The collapse of North Korea in the 1990s did not lead to a Pax Americana in Asia. Instead, it created a power vacuum and unleashed the forces of nationalism and historical rivalry that the Cold War had held in check. The Korean Peninsula, no longer a simple ideological fault line, became the epicenter of a new great game. A fragile, unified Korea struggled with its internal demons while trying to navigate a treacherous path between a Chinese dragon and an American eagle. The fall of one dictatorship had inadvertently set the stage for a far larger, more unpredictable, and infinitely more dangerous confrontation between the great powers of the 21st century. The year is 2005. A decade has passed since the Great Collapse. For a generation of Koreans born after the fall, the arduous march and the DMZ are stories from history books, not lived realities. On the surface, the transformation is a miracle. The skeletal, grey cities of the former North are now bustling hives of construction and commerce, their skylines redrawn by the glass and steel of southern conglomerates. A high-speed rail line and engineering marvel now connects Seoul to Pyongyang in under an hour, a symbol of a nation physically stitched back together. But beneath this shimmering veneer of progress, the new unified Republic of Korea is a nation wrestling with its own ghosts, a society deeply scarred and profoundly divided. The war for survival is over, but the battle for Korea's soul is a grinding, daily struggle. For the people of the South, the decade has been one of immense sacrifice and simmering resentment. The miracle on the Han River has slowed to a crawl, burdened by the colossal, unending cost of northern reconstruction. The reunification tax, once a temporary emergency measure, is now a permanent and painful fixture of every citizen's life. Social services in the South have been curtailed, university tuitions have soared, and the dream of home ownership has slipped away for many middle-class families. The patriotic fervor of 1995 has evaporated, replaced by a widespread reunification fatigue. In the bars and living rooms of Seoul and Busan, conversations are laced with bitterness. Many feel they are paying the price for a history they did not create, their own prosperity sacrificed to uplift a people they increasingly see as culturally alien. In the North, life is undeniably better than it was under the Kims, yet it is a world of bewildering change and dislocation. A new class system has emerged, an unspoken social apartheid. Those from the north are often referred to dismissively as Buk-Saram or North people, their distinct accents and unfamiliarity with modern life marking them as second-class citizens. While a new, small northern middle class has emerged, those who have adapted quickly to the competitive capitalist system, millions remain trapped in poverty, working low-wage construction or factory jobs for southern companies. They live in a world built by their southern brethren, but one in which they often feel like strangers. The freedom to speak is new, but the freedom from want remains elusive for many. The greatest battlefield for Korea's future is the classroom. The government in Seoul has invested billions in creating a unified curriculum, trying to forge a single national identity from two peoples driven apart by 50 years of history. For children born after the collapse, there is hope. They learn a shared history, play on the same sports teams, and absorb the same global pop culture. Yet, the playground is often where the societal rift is most visible. Children can be cruel, and a northern accent or a parent's lower status job can become a source of bullying. In the high schools, teachers walk a fine line. They must educate students about the real horrors of the Kim regime, the famines, the prison camps, without demonizing the ancestors of half the children in their classroom. It is a delicate, painful process of confronting a shared but unequal trauma. For the older generations, especially those who survived the camps and the famine, healing remains a distant prospect. In the late 1990s, the government established a Truth, Reconciliation and History Commission, modeled on South Africa's post-apartheid efforts. It held televised hearings where survivors gave harrowing testimony and former low-level regime functionaries confessed their roles. The archives of the State Security Department were opened, revealing the scale of the state's crimes. But justice for millions of victims has been impossible. The top echelon of the Kim regime perished in the collapse, escaping any earthly tribunal. The sheer number of perpetrators in the mid to lower ranks meant that mass trials were impractical. For many survivors, there is no closure, only the quiet dignity of memory. Memorials to the victims of the famine and the political purges now stand in every major city, stark, silent reminders of the price of ideology. The new Korea's place in the world remains as precarious as its internal cohesion. The uneasy peace of the mid-90s has solidified into a tense, permanent reality. The northern provinces, while sovereign Korean territory, are economically captive to Beijing. China's investments have given it control over the region's critical ports and natural resources, a powerful lever it uses to ensure Seoul remains deferential to its interests. The alliance with the United States has survived, but it is a partnership forged in mistrust. The discovery of Seoul's clandestine nuclear program in the early 2000s, a desperate bid for ultimate self-reliance, permanently damage relations with Washington. American troops remain, but their presence is a point of constant political friction, and the US now views its Korean ally with a wariness once reserved for its adversaries. The peninsula is no longer a flashpoint, but a fulcrum, a nation caught in a delicate, high-stakes balancing act between the ambitions of two superpowers. 10 years on, the unified Korea is a nation of profound contradictions. It is a technological powerhouse, yet millions of its citizens are still learning the basics of a market economy. It is a vibrant democracy, yet haunted by the ghosts of a totalitarian past. It is one nation, yet two peoples, separated by a chasm of experience. The path forward is uncertain, laden with the burdens of history and the challenges of the future. The generation now coming of age will inherit this complex legacy, the pride of a reunited homeland and the immense unfinished task of making it whole, not just on the map but in the hearts of its people. The collapse was an earthquake that leveled the old world. A decade later, Koreans are still learning how to build amidst the aftershocks. The world we have just explored is a world of ghosts, a world born from a single moment of hesitation in Pyongyang, a crack in the foundation of a totalitarian dynasty. We have witnessed a timeline of chaos and unintended consequences, where a nation's collapse did not bring a simple, happy ending, but instead unleashed a torrent of new and dangerous challenges. We saw a humanitarian crisis morph into a geopolitical feeding frenzy, with China carving out a permanent sphere of influence and a US-backed South staggering into the capital. We saw the dream of reunification become a waking nightmare for South Korea, a multi-trillion-dollar burden that fractured its society and stalled its own progress. We witnessed the emergence of a new Korea, geographically whole but spiritually sundered, a nation of two peoples living under one flag but separated by an invisible wall of trauma, resentment, and cultural misunderstanding. And we saw the entire strategic map of Asia redrawn, with a rearming Japan and a unified Korea caught in a perilous new great game, ultimately seeking its own nuclear deterrent not out of aggression, but out of a desperate fear of its powerful neighbors and wavering allies. This timeline, for all its darkness, is a fiction. It is a ghost story, but its power lies in how closely it shadows our own reality. The great crisis of the 1990s was not an invention for this story. It was terrifyingly real. The Soviet Union did collapse, the aid did vanish. The floods and famine did kill millions of people in what remains one of the great, underreported atrocities of the 20th century. The death of Kim Il-sung in 1994 did create a moment of profound uncertainty, and intelligence agencies around the world did place their bets on the regime's imminent demise. The river of history truly did teeter on the edge of a precipice. So why did our world diverge? Why did the Democratic People's Republic of Korea survive? The answer, it seems, lies in a combination of ruthless will, strategic calculation, and international inaction. In our history, Kim Jong-il did not fail to consolidate power. He proved to be far more cunning and brutal than outside observers had predicted. Through his military-first, or Songun policy, he elevated the Korean People's Army above all other organs of the state, ensuring the loyalty of the only institution that could truly depose him. He bought their allegiance with food, resources, and privilege, while the rest of the country starved. He ruthlessly purged any official, no matter how senior, who showed the slightest hint of dissent. Where our alternate timelines saw hesitation and infighting, the real Kim Jong-il imposed a singular, terrifying will. He did not allow the cracks to spread, he filled them with blood and fear. Furthermore, the international response was different. While a hard collapse was debated as a possibility, the world's major powers ultimately chose containment over intervention. China, after weighing its options, decided that a broken but existing North Korea was a better buffer than the chaos of a collapsed one. They did not carve out a stabilization zone. Instead, they provided just enough fuel and food aid to keep the regime on life support, preventing a total state failure while cementing Pyongyang's dependency on Beijing. The United States and South Korea, for their part, pursued diplomacy. The 1994 agreed framework, for all its flaws, provided a channel for communication and a trickle of aid, which, while intended to bribe Pyongyang away from its nuclear ambitions, also served to slightly alleviate the pressure on the regime. There was no grand rescue, but a series of ad hoc decisions that together allowed the state to stumble through its darkest hour. The regime did not survive because it was strong, but because its enemies were cautious, and its only ally decided it was too big to fail. Reflecting on this alternate path forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The survival of the Kim regime was not a victory. It ensured that the suffering of the North Korean people would be prolonged for decades. The prison camps would continue to operate. The development of nuclear weapons would accelerate. The famines would eventually subside, but the chronic malnutrition and systemic oppression would become permanent features of life. The problem of North Korea was not solved. It was deferred, passed down to a new generation. The ghost story of a 1990s collapse shows us that even the most desired outcome can lead to a future fraught with peril. It reminds us that history is a chain of cause and effect, where every action, from a general's order to a diplomat's handshake, has unforeseen consequences that ripple across time. Today, the Korean Peninsula remains locked in a state of suspended animation, a relic of a war that never officially ended. The fundamental instability remains. The questions we have explored in this alternate history are not merely academic. What will happen when the current leadership faces a crisis it cannot control? How will China, South Korea, Japan, and the United States react when not if the next moment of profound fragility arrives? The world of 2025 is vastly different from that of 1995, but the strategic dilemmas are largely the same. The story of what might have been serves as a stark warning, a cautionary tale about the devastating cost of both action and inaction. It teaches us that the pathways of history are forged in moments of crisis, by the choices made by flawed human beings under immense pressure. And it leaves us with one final, lingering question. The next time the river of history threatens to break its banks on the Korean Peninsula, which channel will it carve?